start. You are going to hear a very interesting presentation by Professor Frank Scherbaum from Germany. Thank you very much for coming all the way for a comprehensive, basically, plan to quantify epistemic uncertainty and lots of interesting results. Frank, please.
Thanks a lot, Joseph. You have already given my main conclusions. So what I'm going to talk about this afternoon is on epistemic uncertainty. And the kind of concrete questions which I want to address are all related to the comparison of models. In the EPRI 2004 study, for example, the definition of ground motion model clusters was a major issue, which is closely related to the question if we can quantify the proximity of models. What I will try to show is that we can actually visualize this proximity in an intuitive way. In other words, we can map epistemic uncertainties, provided we perform a simple transformation of our models. I'm going to use some tools from the field of high-dimensional data visualization, which I do not expect you to be familiar with. Therefore, I will try to explain them with examples of no engineering relevance. So please stay with me during that little detour. I promise at the end of my presentation, we will be dealing with ground motion models again. Within the SHAC framework, the standard tool for capturing epistemic uncertainty is the logic tree, which is essentially a set of models with corresponding weights. And from this set of models with weight, we can compute the distribution of mu and sigma. And this then represents the epistemic uncertainty on ground motion in the logic tree framework, from which we can determine sigma mu and sigma sigma. And an important aspect in this context is that the weights are given on the models and not on the values. And jokingly speaking, one could compare this with a process in which somebody has put some items into these drawers, and we now subsequently assign price tags to them without really looking inside the drawers. This, however, naturally invites trouble when we discover that this way we may try to sell the same item for largely different prices. Technically speaking, what we are doing when we are giving weights to models is comparing purely on a so-called nominal scale. It is long known, since 1947 in this famous science paper, that every comparison requires a scale. Stevens demonstrated in 1947 that there are only 4 different types of scales, each allowing different things to be done. On the lowest end, we have the nominal scale. There are only labels on the things we are trying to compare. The gender scale is an example for such a scale, and it contains only 2 categories in the gender scale. One level up on the ordinal scale, there is order in the things we want to compare. For example, the macroseismic intensity scale. We have macroseismic intensities running from 1 to, let's say, 10 or 12, depending on the scale. And the problem there is if you take intervals on this, they don't have a meaning. The difference between a intensity 4 and 2 is not the same as the difference between an intensity 10 and 8. So there is an order, but the intervals do not have a meaning, which they have if we move one step up in a higher scale. For example, the temperature scale in Celsius or Fahrenheit is an interval scale, and the highest scale is a ratio scale where even ratios have a meaning. For example, the weight scale. We can say somebody is twice as heavy as somebody else. On a nominal scale, we can only define equality and non-equality. So there's no order, but we can just say 2 things are different, but we cannot say how different they are. And this, however, is needed when we compare ground motion models. For example, when we want to deal with model redundancy or completeness of the model space. Therefore, in the way the logic tree analysis is usually done by assigning weights to models, we can only crudely deal with problems such as the redundancy problem. So it invites unintended inconsistencies in giving the weights. On the other hand, assigning weights to ground motion values, this would be on a ratio scale, is too difficult. There's no intuition for the quality of a numerical value. And the question I want to address is, can these 2 perspectives be reconciled? And I believe, yes, they can, if we perform a simple transformation, if we make a simple trick, namely if we transform ground motion models into finite length model representation vectors. I will also use the term feature vectors or model feature vectors in this context. And the procedure is very simple. It simply means that one has to evaluate the model for different settings of the predictor variable. So for different magnitudes, distances, and frequencies, and then combine the predicted values, the median and sigma values, into a long vector. And this means essentially we are sampling the ground motion model. Or in the context of digital signal processing, this would correspond to the process of discretization. Once one has accepted this discretization of ground motion models into model representation vectors, a number of very powerful tools becomes available. For example, for the visualization, for analyzing the structure of the model space, for example, for measuring the proximity of models, for analyzing clustering properties, and also for addressing the redundancy problem. Also for model testing, which I do not want to go into at all. In particular, we can make use of ideas and tools from other fields of sciences, namely the field of high-dimensional information visualization and multidimensional scaling. And the core tools in this context go under the name of Sammon's maps and self-organizing maps, also called Kohonen networks. These model representation vectors may contain many, many elements, depending on how finely I want to sample the ground motion model. And so they can be seen as points in a very high-dimensional space, the dimension of which depends on the coarseness of the discretization. And each of these model representation vectors, MRVs, contains the complete information about the corresponding model if we have sampled it finely enough. We have long gotten used to accept that discretized vectors represent complete information about continuous processes. For example, when we listen to digitized music or when we work with digital seismograms. And sometimes these representations are even more efficient than the continuous representation. For example, when we represent a continuous sinusoid just by its amplitude and phase, or when we represent a linear filter by its poles and zeros, as it's done here. Another key concept which we will need in the following is that of a manifold. This is a mathematical object, a mathematical space, which can be arbitrarily warped. But if you look at it in a fine enough scale, it's locally Euclidean, and therefore it can be mapped. An easy example of that is the surface of the Earth. This is a two-dimensional manifold, which we can obviously represent by maps, by an atlas, but it's embedded in 3 dimensions. So we will use a similar analogy in the case when we deal with ground motion models. Two assumptions I will make in this context. The first assumption is that a given set of model representation vectors can be represented by a two-dimensional manifold embedded in a very high-dimensional space. This means that the model representation vectors span some warped surface which is embedded in a very, very high-dimensional space, and the structure of which we assume that we can learn. And the tool which we use for learning is that of a self-organizing map, which is a special type of artificial neural network. A self-organizing map is basically a set of nodes, which is usually arranged in such a regular grid, either rectangular or hexagonal. And each of these nodes is associated with a prototype vector, which is of the same dimension as the data space. So in this case, we have 60 nodes, so we have 60 prototype vectors, which are somewhere located in a high-dimensional space. So now what we want to do with these prototype vectors, we want to rearrange them such that they mimic the distribution of our data vectors. And this is done during the learning phase of the self-organizing map. So the prototype vectors actually learn by training how the data vectors are arranged. And they do this in a way without any interaction. We do not have to train them in a supervised way, but they learn this in an unsupervised way. And the easiest way to see how this is done is just by watching them learn. So here we are having a set of data points, which are around 1,000, I think. And we want to learn the structure of this distribution, which is uniform. We want to learn this with 16 prototype vectors. So the way this is done is one takes these 16 prototype vectors and their connections, shown here by these lines, and places them randomly into the data space. So the data space in this case is two-dimensional, so we don't actually have to do a mapping where we can just watch the prototype vectors in the data space. Then the next step is to randomly choose a training vector. So here, this is this ball, which is chosen as the training vector in this moment. And then, subsequently, it is determined which is the closest prototype vector. Which one of those vectors spanning this net is closest to the training vector. And then this network is deformed in a way so that it's pulled towards the training vector. And this is a process which is very similar to our neurons when they learn. So when light hits our eyes and the neuron pattern in our brain is activated, it's a very simple set of rules which is used here in an artificial way. So and this is repeated until the network is actually learning that these data are uniformly distributed. And you will see, once the learning phase is over, that then this network will spread out evenly. You see now it's reorganizing itself without any interaction, and it's now at the end of the learning process. And here you see how many steps, so it's not showing every step, how many steps it takes to come to this conclusion that the data are uniformly distributed. So some important aspects here is the learning is by self-organization. So we have to check if it was successful, so we have to check the convergence. This is one aspect which we have to keep in mind. And the final configuration depends on the starting vectors. If I would have start from a different initial configuration, the net may be oriented by 45 degrees, but it would still be spread out evenly, indicating that it's a uniform distribution. A very interesting aspect is that the topological neighborhood of the network is preserved. So when I map it down to the final sum, which I'll show in a minute, I know exactly where the prototype vector is located in the high dimensional space if I go, let's say, to the north, to the east, or to the west of a particular node. The proximity measure between models is by choice. So here I choose just Euclidean difference between two vectors, but there are other options. For example, from an information theoretic point of view, one could use Kullback-Leibler distances, because these are probability density functions which we are representing in the model representation vector. So one could use this as a more appropriate measure, or one could use Manhattan distance, or whatever one wanted to choose. Here is a slightly more challenging example where we have clusters. So the network is now, which is now going to learn, is learning the cluster structure. Remember I said the goal of this network is rearranging the prototype vectors in a way so that it learns the distribution of the data vector. And it takes some time here. If you see again the index of the iterations, but eventually it will discover by randomly selecting training vectors from this distribution that there are 3 clusters, and it will even distribute the prototype vectors in a way so that the cluster density is maintained. So here you have more prototype vectors because there's a denser cluster than here and here. So this is an easy way to map out the distribution of vectors. And an even more challenging situation is if you're going to higher dimensions. So here to a 3-dimensional situation where I've put 3 clusters on the surface of a sphere. And now I'm only showing the network, how it's developing, and only the individual training vector during one choice, which is randomly selected from these data here. So we will now see how the SOM learns the structure of this data in 3 dimensions. And there's always a situation where the network has a very regular structure, and now it will discover that it's on the surface of a sphere, and then subsequently it will also discover that there are different densities. So, and again, you see there are quite a number of steps, so it's not something which is done in a few steps. It takes thousands of steps, of which I only show once in a while particular steps. And you see here now the density structure of the clusters is recognized. So the network has learned the structure. So now we can go on to higher dimensions. As an intermediate step to ground motion models, I'm now going to 25 dimensions. So I'm looking at as model representation vectors of 25 dimensions, and I'm looking at a special case, namely a binary value. So only zeros and ones are maintained or contained in this model representation vector, and this is simply a flattened pixel representation of letters. So I've just unwrapped them, and then each of the letters is now represented by one model representation vector. Now we have a problem, because now we have only 25 data vectors, so we have only 25 vectors for training, so we have to reuse them. And this is done in a random fashion. So there is one has to define a number of repetitions of the data vectors, which is several thousand, for example, 2,000 times, and then it's randomly picking out of these vectors the training vector. And then it has to be checked if the learning was successful. So we have to compare the original training vectors with what the SOM actually does, with the best matching prototype vectors, and you can see that the match after the SOM has converged is perfect. We can completely recover the individual model vectors. I haven't shown you a SOM at all so far. Actually, what is called a SOM, the self-organizing map, is then a map which is mapping the distances of these model representation vectors in the high-dimensional space down to 2 dimensions. And it's doing this in a color code, which is here now going from dark colors, indicating large distances between model representation vectors, to light colors, indicating small distances. And this can be read like a landscape. So we can look at this as an area of mountains. This would be the dark hexagons, or valleys. So the light colors would indicate a flatland. And we can just imagine that these vectors live in either the mountains or in the valleys. And we can see here there are several of these vectors which live happily together in the valley because they are very similar. For example, the S and the G are very similar, as we can easily see, and they are not so different from the E. For example, the W and the Y are separated by a mountain range. So in order to imagine the distance, we have to imagine how long it would take to hike from one position to another one. If we go directly across these mountains, it takes quite some time. It may be even shorter to walk around. So it's not easily seen what the real distance is from one point to another one. The shortest one has always to be calculated. But we can calculate now the distances between two vectors. And this shows actually the morphology which we have to take into account when doing this. So when we now calculate distances between two model vectors, between the A and the B, we have to take into account the shape of this surface on which the model representation vectors actually live. We cannot go the direct Euclidean distances in this high-dimensional space. Then we would do the same as if we would calculate the distance between New York and, let's say, Tokyo by going through the interior of the Earth. We don't do this if we calculate distances on the Earth also. We also always take into account that the surface is warped. So we can calculate now the distances between two model representation vectors. And if we do this for every combination, take into account the morphology of the manifold on which the letters live, we obtain a distance matrix. So here you see the difference between, or the distance between each letter with respect to each other letter. So we can see, for example, that the letter I has large distances from the dark colors to all the other letters except for the T. When you look at where the T is, then it has a small value here. And so you can do this for every combination. And this way you can actually calculate the distances between any two vectors. But this is not very intuitive. There's an easier way to visualize that, and that is to try configurations of points in 2 dimensions and calculate their 2-dimensional distances in a way and see if the matrix, the distance matrix, is actually similar, and then modify the positions of these 2 dimensions in a smart way until we find a configuration which actually has the same distance matrix as the distances on the high-dimensional warped surface, on the manifold. So we do this until we find one that matches. Of course, one doesn't do this just by stupid searching by Monte Carlo. This would be too long, but there are smart ways of doing this. And actually the tools for that come from graph theory, and they are very efficient. So if we do this, if we actually try to find such a combination, what this is doing is called a Sammon's map. So here we found the best matching two-dimensional configurations to represent the distance matrix on the SOM. And the points which correspond to that are located here. And here, all the mutual differences between each combination of points, for example, between the I and the H and the R and the A, they are identical to the distances in the high dimensional space. So this is a full representation, as good as the distance matrices match, of the information in the high dimensional model space. So we see here, for example, just what I showed, that the I and the T are very similar. We see this now by their position being also very similar on this Sammon's map. So this is a Sammon's map of the SOM. And we can look at each of the letters, and this makes sense if we compare this with our mental images of how the actual images are similar or are not similar. So the tools which I have used so far and which we will use in the following is, for once, the SOM, which learns the structure of the model feature vector space, and the Sammon's map of the SOM, which enables us to calculate and display in a very intuitive way the mutual distances between model feature vectors, taking into account the structure of the manifold. So now we are ready to go to higher dimensions and actually go to ground motion models. So this was the model representation vector for the letter A. So we now want to apply the same set of tools to ground motion models. And as I said earlier, what we do is we sample the ground motion models for different magnitude frequencies in a certain range. And what I've done here is I have used the Abrahamson and Silver model from 1997 and evaluated it for a magnitude 5 at 10 frequencies and 10 distances. The frequencies were spread between 1 and 10 hertz, and the distances between 10 and 100 kilometers. And each of these are pairs of median and sigma values. So for the first sample, this would be the median sigma for the first sample, median sigma for the second, and so forth. And we can still visualize this vector in a very nice way. It's for a single magnitude and for frequencies and distances. So we have a two-dimensional image. And if we separate the median and the sigma parts, we can visualize them in these pixel grids. So here is the frequency axis and the distance axis, and the color code now shows the values, and the same for the sigma. And if we do this for several models, we can already have a comparison of the models in a way which is much more comprehensive than if we compare median curves as a function of distance. So we see here on the left side the median pixel maps for magnitude 5 and the same frequencies and distances, 1 to 10 hertz, 10 to 100 kilometers, for a couple of selected models. And on the right side, the sigma. And we can see also that just comparing the median values, as we often see in papers, is not enough if we want to capture the whole picture. We see that for the same median values, we can have very, very different sigma distributions, which then will have very different effects on the hazard. But just looking at one magnitude and one distance and distances and frequencies is not very satisfying. So what we want to do is we want to look at the whole magnitude. We want to look at magnitude, distances, and frequencies at a minimum. And here I've done this for a model by Coton et al. For magnitudes from 5 to 7 in steps of 0.5 magnitude units, for frequencies between 1 and 10 hertz, and distances again from 10 to 100 kilometers. Here the visualization is a little bit more challenging, but it still can be done. If we go from pixel maps to so-called volume pixels, voxel grids. So here we have now a voxel grid representation of the median values of the Coton et al. Model in a magnitude range from 5 to 7 and a distance range 10 to 100 kilometers and frequencies 1 to 10 hertz. And on the right side for the sigma. Now we have selected an arbitrary mix of models, and you will find the NGA models color-coded in a reddish color. Here's the Campbell, Bosonia, Bourne, Atkinson, and the Eastern North American in blue colors, then the European ones in greenish colors, then Pankow and Pechmann got a different color, and Japanese models in a, what is it, brownish orange color. So and if we do the same exercise now and produce the voxel grid representation, we can compare this as whole unities already in a very comprehensive way. So instead of purely keeping them in our mental drawers as labels, we have already moved away from the purely nominal scale and look at them already in some sort of ordinal scale, because the color code means something here. We see, for example, that the Acker and Bommer 2007 model is very similar to the NGA models in the median, but that it differs quite a bit in the sigma. And this was the reason, or partially the reason, that Julian reconsidered this model and changed the sigma model behind that. And we can also see that, for example, the Coton et al. Model stands out a little bit, as does the McVeary model, for example, from New Zealand, stands out mostly here. So now if we let the SOM do its magic again, we need to check if the SOM has actually converged, which we can do again by comparing the training vectors with the best matching model vector. So we have to compare these pairs for each of the models. And we see, again, the SOM has converged nicely. There is no visual differences between the best matching units and the training vectors. And the same for the sigma. So now we can actually project the differences between, or the distances between those model representation vectors, between the ground motion models as represented by the model representation vectors on the SOM. And this is now the resulting landscape. This is called the U matrix. It's a very popular way of plotting the SOMs. And as I showed earlier, you can interpret this as landscape in which dark colors mean mountains. So in order to get there, you have to hike quite a while. So this indicates large distances. And everything in a light shaded area means flatland. So it's very easy to go from here to here, or it's much easier to go from here to here than, for example, from here to here. So what we can see here right away is the relationship of the models in this SOM, which shows the morphology of the manifold. The McVeary model tries to move away as much as possible from all the other models. It's now living in a very remote mountainous area in the northeast. On the other side, the Eastern North American model, the Atkinson 08 and Atkinson and Boer 07, they are living on the other side. And you can also see by looking at the median voxel plots how different they are. Just visually, they are living in a hilly terrain, and they are not so far away from the others. They are a little bit away, but not so far. And the ones which are closest together are Chu and Young's and Abrahams and Silva NGA models. So we can look at this piece by piece in order to try to understand the differences. And one gets more information out of this if one doesn't look at the average distances between a node and its neighboring models, but if one actually splits up each hexagon into 6 triangles, each of which has 2 internal and 1 external boundary, which touches a neighboring hexagon, and then color codes or shades it according to the distance in that direction. So here we can see how anisotropic actually the distance distribution is, and this has to be taken into account when one calculates the distance between one model and another. What I also find quite instructive to look at is to superimpose the voxel grids for all the models, for all the prototype models, because this illustrates how the SOM actually interpolates between the training models. In other words, it shows the morphology of the manifold, and it illustrates the relationships within the whole set of models very nicely. In contrast to a logic tree representation, these models are now on an interval scale. This means the distances have a meaning, and not only the distances, but also directions, because, as I said earlier, the SOM is topology preserving. So, the most instructive map, of course, as I showed earlier, is the Sammon's map of the SOM. Here now all the mutual relationships between models are trying to be mapped. So we can see here that what we saw in the SOM, that namely the Abrahamson and Silva NGA and the Chu and Young's NGA models live closely together in the valley, is represented by them being located very closely together here. And 2 other NGA models are located here. So 4 of the 5 NGA models are located not too far away from each other. There's one NGA model, we have to look into that why, and it's interesting now to see, is trying to move away a little bit. And as we could see in the SOM, for the McVary model, which lived on this high mountain in the northeast, it's far, far, far away from the rest of the models. And here the Atkinson 08 and Atkinson and Boer models from eastern North America go down into this part. And here are the Japanese models. So one can now try to interpret those relationships. So the question remains is, I have to emphasize one thing. This map is, of course, only representing the relationships for the chosen magnitude, distance, and frequency range. So it would look different if I would choose a different frequency range. For sure, the Toro model, which here moves closely to the Abrahamson and Silva 97 model, if I go up to PGA, would move away. This is only an image of relationships for a given set of ranges. So the question is, how good is this representation? Do these points really capture the mutual distances of 16,000 dimensional vectors? In order to answer this, we have to compare the distance matrices. If they match, then it's good. If they do not match, then we have a problem. And I would say the fit is excellent, as you can see from the comparison of the distance matrix calculated on the Sammon's map of the SOM and on the SOM itself. So we can now be confident that actually the points we have just seen really represent the mutual distances of the models in this high-dimensional space. And what is even more important, the axes have a meaning. They, in this case, are average Euclidean distances. If I would have chosen, for example, Kullback-Leibler distances between the model, then this would be bit. I could really express the information loss or the relative information loss between models in units which have a meaning. So this allows to quantitatively display epistemic uncertainties in units, which we can actually choose, and we can think about what is meaningful or not. It measures something which I think we have never measured before. So why live safe? Now, with the final slides, I'm going to risk an outlook on what I believe are some of the potential applications. Due to the lack of time, I can only sketch these and I cannot go into real detail. But I think some of the applications are rather obvious. For example, one of the most immediate applications I can imagine is that one can simply use these maps as visual tools, at least to partially reconcile the gap between a model-based and a value-based perspective when defining logic trees and weights. What I've done here is to illustrate this idea is I've taken the Sammon's map of the SOM and I've calculated the convex hull, so it's the boundary of these points, and I've also calculated a Voronoi cell separation so that one can see the region which each of the model represents. And I think such a plot could be helpful in defining the relative weights on a logic tree. Or one could use the SOMs for interpolation. The SOMs allow a consistent interpolation of models and opens the door to different sampling strategies. Where it can do really some good is in the context of dealing with partially redundant models, for example, caused by overlapping data sets. So in the logic tree perspective, we have our set of models, so model 1 till model, 25 here, and for each of them we give weights. So what happens if we know that some of the models are based on overlapping data set? How can we deal with this in this framework? Well, one could go back to the data sets and look how many data records are actually overlapping. And then one could calculate a distance matrix or adjacency matrix from the amount of mutual overlap between models. And this has been done in the context of another study, namely the Pegasus project by John Douglas and Nico Kuhn. And this was the result. So one could in principle use this distance matrix to correct the weighting factors for this data overlap. But what if the data overlap is 100%, for example, and only different functional forms are used? Then we really have to scratch our heads. However, when we move away from this logic tree perspective and move to the Sammon's map representation, then the model space becomes some weirdly shaped region on this map. And each individual model will become an individual point. So if we generate a new model, for example, by reusing some of the data, what will happen then? We will have another point in a region where there is already a point. This, however, will pull more prototype vectors during the learning phase into that region. So what happens is only that this region of the manifold is sampled more finely. And it will not have a major effect on the extent of the model region unless we are dealing with a model which is right on the border of the Sammon's map of the SOM. The same thing would happen if we are using only a different functional form, but the data set is identical. Again, we would get additional models in a particular region, which would then cause the local topology there to be sampled better. So in conclusion, there is no real redundancy issue if we are working in this domain. However, what we would be doing then is we would actually perform a major paradigm shift. We would move away from the purely model perspective, and we would move into a domain where the epistemic uncertainty is no longer represented by a set of weights defined over a set of categories, but by a probability density function on the model domain. So for example here on the Sammon's map of the SOM. And if new models are constructed from overlapping data sets, it doesn't matter. These models would be like bootstrap samples where one reuses data also. And it will just make them appear closer to each other. So if we could then look at we can then look at the weights on the individual models simply as samples of this probability density function. And if we think of this image of the Voronoi cells, which I just projected earlier, one could use the cell size in order to make sure that the integration goes to 1 over this probability density function. So I could go on for another hour illustrating some other potential ideas, and some people have seen me doing this already. But in conclusion, I believe that representing ground motion models as finite length model representation vectors combined with multidimensional scaling techniques enables a completely new perspective on dealing with epistemic uncertainties. I think down the road, such a representation may even be an alternative to logic trees, since it would mean working on an interval instead of a nominal scale. However, I admit that I'm far from understanding all the dirty details and potential pitfalls, and there's still a lot of road work to do if one wants to go down the road in order to make this road passable. But I believe, and I hope I have convinced you of that it's definitely worth exploring. And finally, I don't want to forget to mention my co-workers on this from the University of Potsdam, my graduate student Nico Kühn and Andreas Köhler, and my co-workers Matthias Ornberger and Carsten Rickelson. Actually, Matthias and Andreas, they got me interested in the topic of self-organizing maps in the first place. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much. Very interesting. Question from Frank. For Frank. Yeah, Norm. Yeah, push. What? No, no, underneath.
I move this at the same time.
Okay.
So. No, I just want to make sure the space for Jim Broom for the next presentation that the computer can be moved up. This is the computer.
Is this working? This one, yeah, okay. So if we took a bunch of models, you're able to map out a space as to where the models are existing. and you could get the PDF of the model space. I understood that. How are you going to deal with the concept that we would say, yes, here is a model, but I don't think it is as applicable to the Eastern United States as another model? I mean, how would we deal with that problem?
The way I have thought about this so far, and I admit it's just at the beginning, is that I would use a Bayesian approach. I would span the whole model space and use not only the individual training vectors, but also these intermediate nodes. And then I would have to give a prior on all of them, which could be an ignorant prior to the degree I can do it, and then use data. And this data could be either observed ground motion records or intensities converted then to that, and then use a Bayesian updating and see if those data actually constrain this. Did I make...
I understand, but would you actually then, you have a whole mapped out model space, you
Yeah.
build it in, and now you're going to change the weights based on some data testing.
Then I would hope that those which are not really applicable would be thrown out by the data, because the likelihood in the updating would be so small, if they're really not applicable, that they would actually be ignored.
But what about if you just want to weight them differently?
You can, but this would only go into the prior weights, because only the prior weights would be the expert weights, and the rest would be done by the data. And if the data are not informative, they will tell you, because then they would just leave you with a prior weighting.
One more question.
Sorry, I don't think you can go back to your slides. But
No, I turned off the computer because we had a different... I used my own computer because of the movie.
Yeah, so I'll just... you had a graph that at the end that shows that you draw some polygons around the models. Based on those, have you done any comparison between like what kind of weights you would get from those compared to the equal weighting that right now is being suggested for all those NGA models?
Now, where I'm at right now with this whole set of techniques is at the visualization part. And I've just begun to explore all the potential applications going really into hazard. And this is just the very, very beginning. And there's one paper which is hopefully appearing soon in Earthquake Spectra, which is purely on the visualization part. But there's still so much work to be done in order to really remove all the roadblocks on this road to make sure that this is really working in practice.
Thanks.
By the way, Frank, for the cases that you showed, the site condition was for rock.
The site condition was for rock, yes.
Okay, one more question if you have for Frank. Okay, Frank, wait. Yeah, Brian has.
So I understand you base your study on ground motion predicted from various models, right? So if you find similarity in ground motion, okay, and how do you go from ground motion back to a attenuation model, especially when your results is magnitude and frequency and distance dependent? How would you come back and build additional attenuation model from your results?
The additional attenuation models I was referring to are the ones which are built during the learning phase of the self-organizing maps. So they are the ones which help mapping the morphology of this manifold. So they are already there once the SOM has learned. And this is the set which is just defined by the models which I put into the learning. So in this case it was 16 models. And the additional ones I was referring to are the ones which make up the manifold. So like the spanning vectors of those.
So you get ground motion values.
I can, yes.
And
I can use them in a predictive mode if I wish.
okay.
Yeah.
So it has to be used in the predictive mode, not in terms of model.
Yeah.
In terms of individual models.
Yeah. You can also calculate hazard curves for each of them and then see what this maps to in hazard space, which is an interesting exercise also. But these are all things which need to be explored very systematically, and I hesitate a little bit to be too visionary here.
Great. Thank you very much, Frank. I appreciate that. The last